Welcome everybody to this call between Joe and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, MD. So this call is hosted by VIEW, which is a transformative education, leadership development, and corporate culture change company. VIEW stands for vulnerability, impartiality, empathy, and wonder, a state of mind that we train as a beginning first step to relating to ourselves and others with deeper love and kindness. VIEW takes a three-pronged approach with the intellectual, emotional, and nervous system to work on limiting beliefs. And it's really about lowering resistance to the experience that's available in every moment in a container of love. Moving forward, VIEW will be focused on an intensive year-long program for senior leaders and organizational culture change programs. Prior to founding VIEW, Joe was a VC investor and foundation managing director, both of which focused on companies and organizations with a mission to raise consciousness, whether it was increasing social emotional fluidity in children or conscious parenting. There was a range, but it was all focused on how can we increase the holistic well-being of children and adults. And for our guests, we have the introduction of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, MD, who we're very privileged to have and has spent his whole career studying how children and adults adapt to traumatic experiences and has translated his emerging findings from neuroscience and attachment research to develop and study a range of potentially effective treatments for traumatic stress in children and adults. He is the author of The Body Keeps the Score, our own recommended reading that we do as part of our 18-month course. So everyone who's attended the VIEW Earthshakers program has read your book on this call. And his efforts have led to the establishment of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a congressionally mandated initiative that now funds approximately 150 centers specializing in treatment. The center, a treatment center, a research lab, and numerous trainings worldwide for a range of individuals. So with that, let's start the call between you two, and we're super excited and looking forward to the call today. And I'll stop my video so people will only be able to see YouTube from now on. Enjoy.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Mina. Thanks for coming, Bessel. I really appreciate you taking the time with us. Let's start off just with a question. When you think about trauma, there's something there, let's say there's this range of trauma, and one side is like beaten daily and molested weekly trauma for a child. And the other side of trauma would be, the far end might be something like heavily criticized by a parent or not picked up as a 2-year-old consistently when they were scared and being told, you have to be tough in this world, right? Where do you draw the line on what trauma is? And yeah.
Well, I don't think you can draw a line it's not a binary issue.
Yeah.
But what I think is very important and has been of increasing concern to me is that, these are all historical developments. We're all part of a culture and part of a political culture. And so we started off looking at trauma through the eyes of Vietnam veterans. Right? What's interesting is that up to then, child abuse basically didn't exist. Rape didn't exist. Domestic violence didn't exist. It's just amazing how until the middle 80s or something, this whole issue was completely not being looked at. And then we got trauma. And we talked about it as an extraordinary event that's outside of usual human experience, and an event. And then so it became like something terrible happens and it changes you. And it turned out that most of these assumptions were sort of wrong, but we have sort of run with them in a way, and that trauma is about an event. And these events happen sometimes. A car accident, a rape, they occur very rarely, actually. In my practice, that's not the overwhelming number of people I see, but because we got this PTSD diagnosis, we organized a thinking around an event, and that really messed you up. The other piece that is intriguing here is that this was all developed in the context of the US being the largest war machine since the Roman Empire, basically, and our national treasure being devoted to arming our troops and sending people across. And so our money and our thinking goes into veterans and into grown-up men who get messed up in our culture of war making. But there's two issues there. Veterans are a very small minority of traumatized people. The most people who get traumatized at home by their own caregivers, which is sort of an extraneous issue. And the other thing is that when these veterans came to see us originally, their chief complaint was, I have become a monster. Nobody is safe with me. I blow up at my kids. My wife, who helped me survive Vietnam by sending me letters and being taken care of me, I have no feelings for her. I beat her up, and I've become this monstrous person. But because of politics, we had to link this monstrousness to the war, and we said, oh, the big issue is the memory about the war, about an event. But that was a political move. It was not a scientific move. Because the real issue that we see is that people have a hard time engaging with people, having a hard time understanding other people's point of view, being part of a synchronicity with other human beings. And that's really where the main problem is. But we kept going about, it's the event. And now people can, a lot of the research and newspaper articles say, if we just make that event go away, everything's going to be okay. But that's a complete misunderstanding, because it's about these experiences change who you are. They change how you see the world. So that's one aspect. The second piece is, in the political process again, when we put this diagnosis together, we were very aware that a lot had happened to these people before they went to the war, but we had to get this goddamn diagnosis into the DSM. So we said, no, it has nothing to do with the past. It's all about seeing your best friend being blown up, and it was horrible, and it was horrible. But we already sort of smelled out that a lot of these guys had pre-existing histories of childhood abuse and neglect, which we sort of pretty well guessed had a lot to do with the eventual adaptation, but we ignored that. And then as we have come to move around in the last 30, 35 years, we understand that the biggest issue actually is how you get taken care of by your parents, which is not about trauma. It's about how you get seen, and whether you're known, and whether you have a voice, and whether if you cry, somebody says, oh, honey, let's take care of you, or beats you up and says, shut up, or I'll give you something to cry about. So we now have two parallel issues that are conflicted with each other. One is the whole attachment system and how you deal with other people deal with you, and how you see yourself in the context of other people, which is one dimension. And the other dimension is that something terrible has happened that changes your biology to always be on the alert for danger, because that event may come back to you. But these are rather separate experiences. And so what the research shows, although most people don't talk about it, is that the security of the attachment thing is the biggest issue. And these traumatic events are secondary. But of course, if you have a lot of problematic attachment issues, you become much more likely to get hurt in the context of other human beings. But that becomes the secondary issue.
Yeah. The question I have on that is, let's say you have that acute piece of trauma, and an acute piece of trauma, there are certain things that happen that are pretty consistent, is people are living in that moment even when that moment's no longer existing. There's a physical response. Right. They're even mapping, I would call it, in our world, we call it mapping, where they're kind of manipulating, attracting, and proving this reality.
Yeah. It's a very important point, actually.
Yeah.
And a very mysterious point, actually.
Yeah.
I call this addiction to trauma.
Yes.
And somehow the thing that's most terrifying also becomes the most meaningful in your life.
Yes.
It's a huge issue.
Yes, right. Yeah, I'm
really glad you talk about it.
Yeah, that's our work. And I find that exact same thing happens when you're dealing with attachment, the trauma that happens from lack of attachment in the early, that let's say if a person has been taught that love is criticism, they go around manipulating the world, attracting critical people, proving that love is criticism.
Right.
They're hearing criticism when it doesn't actually happen. And I'm wondering,
You know,
yeah.
okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please, you have a good thought. I want to hear it.
Well, my association is I've always also been puzzled by this addiction to trauma issue. And my great revelation came when I read some piece of rat research where they found a bunch of rats who were raised in a very pleasant, warm, and food environment. Another bunch of rats who were starved and noisy and miserable. And they put them together in a common environment. And then they did nasty things to them. And the rats who came from safe environments ran to safe places. And the rats who came from bad environments went back to the bad place.
Yes.
And so people choose what's familiar over what's safe.
Yes.
It's a huge issue. Yep.
Huge issue. Yeah. The story I tell about this, and I don't know if the research has, but the story that I tell is that, like, our organism is looking for homeostasis again, and so there were some emotions that they weren't allowed to feel in those moments of trauma. And if you allow them to feel, once the body actually allows and looks forward to those emotions that are being held back, then they no longer are attracted to the trauma. That's what I've seen, is that if somebody, go ahead, yeah.
No, say it again.
Yeah, if somebody is, let's make it concrete. Somebody had an emotional abandonment by their parents.
Yeah.
And in that process, there was a deep feeling of aloneness and out of control that they couldn't feel, because if they did, it would be total chaos as a 5 or 10-year-old. If they get to a point where they can look forward to that emotion, that underlying emotion, and actually invite it and feel it and process it in a container, particularly in a container of love, then that's the moment they stop attracting or going towards that same trauma in their life. They stop being attracted to and stop inviting into their lives people who will emotionally abandon them.
Are you saying once the original need gets satisfied?
Once the emotion gets felt, fully felt, right? So there's an emotion of basically, hey, this person who's supposed to take care of me isn't, and the sadness and helplessness of that, if it's fully felt and loved, I would say looked forward to, like cared for, like the child never was, then it shifts. That's what
the way I deal with that.
Yeah.
In our psychodramatic work is to sort of become that 10-year-old kid.
Yes.
And to feel those feelings and to put your father or your mother out there in space and to say, you never paid attention to me, or you just kept putting me down, and then you choose somebody to be an ideal parent.
Yes.
And who holds you, and you feel like you're 10 years old, and he says, if I'd been there when you were 10 years old, I would have paid attention to you. I would have read you bedtime stories every night. And then you get an imprint of, oh, that's what it feels like. And you really get a momentary, visceral satisfaction of that emptiness that you have been feeling all along.
Yeah.
And I take this very seriously. That you need to have a sense in your body of what it's like to feel that hunger satisfied, or that's to know how it can be differently.
Yeah.
And I think our biggest challenge is, how do you get that into people's bodies?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
An alternative reality.
Right. Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about complex PTSD? This is kind of, there's now a book on it, and how do you conceive of this? What do you think?
Well, we sort of invented that, well, complex PTSD is this attachment and trauma issue combined with each other. And this has been so very much from the very beginning. The moment that we got the PTSD diagnosis in, Judy Herman and I started to talk about, but it's more complex than if you were abused and neglected as a kid. You have all these issues about self-esteem, and your body gets very affected, and you get all these illnesses, and you get all these immune problems. And That's complex PTSD. And when Judy first wrote about it, I did. So I did research on it, and we always talked about, in a major way, about the somatic aspects and the immunological aspects. When Judy first talked about it, that sort of body piece was left out still.
Yeah.
But our researchers always said if early on you get neglected and abused, it changes the whole way that your whole organism responds to the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the research that shows that ACEs will increase heart attack rates and diabetes rates and all that.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. How do you define the difference between managing PTSD and healing it? Or even attachment?
I think it's a very important question, actually. And I think what I see people do in academic type research is to manage it. And the outcome measure is whether PTSD symptoms are less, or whether people still meet criteria for PTSD, and there's a certain cutoff point. And I make actually a very big deal out of, no, that's not the right outcome criteria. The right outcome criteria is for people to say, it's over. I used to be an abused and neglected kid, but now I feel loved inside. And so the issue is really not how do we manage it and keep it under control. The issue is how do we resolve it? And in a very large number of people's cases, you can resolve it.
Yeah.
You can actually come into a point and say, Jesus loves me, or whatever the equivalent thereof is. Like I'm a loved person. I'm okay. Yeah.
So one of the things that we talk about is that the trauma that's created in relationship is best healed in relationship. And there's two forms of that can happen. There's the one-on-one of a doctor-client, and then there's also a group of people. And that in that group, there can be a deep feeling of love and acceptance. If that's created, that can do a lot of the healing. I'm curious, what do you see the differences between the one-on-one and the group, if you can really create a container of love inside of that group?
Well, I also don't quite agree with that the relationship is the one thing that cures the trauma.
I wouldn't say one thing. I would just say it's very helpful in it. Yeah.
But of course, the relationship is central.
Yeah.
My take on it, although it's not linear, it's not black or white, is that in order to tell your story and to tease it out and to really know what you went through back then, and to deeply feel, develop a sense of compassion for your internal world. I think the one-on-one relationship where somebody is just focused on you and you don't have to worry about anybody else is pretty damn important.
Mm.
And I don't quite, maybe you can do it, and I really seriously think maybe you know how to do it. In our psychodrama stuff, people do very deep work in a group, but in our psychodrama stuff, we also pay very deep attention to that particular person's experience.
Yeah.
And the group can be very powerful in helping it. But I think doing things in a group is enormously important also to know that this is our common fate. It's part of a human being that sometimes some of us have been luckier than others, is that sometimes you feel unseen, you feel nobody gives a shit about you, and you feel like you need to be there for somebody else and not for you. And at the end, knowing that you're a member of the human race and playing it out as a member of the human race is also terribly important.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a question for you. How do you define, because the reason I'm asking the question is because there's a couple modalities out there that talk about awakening that's found at the bottom of the trauma. There's Tibetan work, and there's also Lowen's work also talks about this. My question for you before we even get into that subject is, how do you define awakening? What do you, what does that mean to you from a psychological perspective?
That is not not the language that I use in any of the ventures I am in. Although when I think about it, I can see how people come to use that word in some way.
Yeah.
And it's a word of what for me means, having never heard it before in this context, is of really seeing yourself with love and compassion and saying, yes, this creature who is me got terribly hurt along the way.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that creature's fault. That creature just was at the wrong time in the wrong place. And I'll help to extricate that person who happens to be me out of that situation.
Yeah.
I imagine that what awakening means.
Yeah. Yeah. That in the human development research, they talk about awakening being a moment where the sense of self shifts into a universal instead of an individual.
Right.
It turns into a universal. I think in different traditions, awakening, a heart awakening would be described exactly how you describe it. That would be called more of a head awakening. But my curiosity is, what's your experience of working with people in their trauma, and that trauma is the key that allows them to find, is there another way to find that deep amount of self-love than outside of going through the trauma? What?
You know, it's a question that has been around as long as I've been in this field. And I think most of us would say most of the time, yes, you need to go into the trauma. And yes, you need to experience what happened to that kid or that person back then. But I'm not 100% sure of that.
Yeah.
I think it's possible. And let's say, one scenario could be like adolescence is an amazing time when your brain is wide open. And you can be a terribly abused and hurt child. And if your first love in your life happens to be a very loving person who makes you feel like you're just a lovely, wonderful person who can share pleasure and commitment and joy with you, as teenagers sometimes have the good luck to have.
Yeah.
Then I think that experience at the right time in the right place can really reset that whole system without having to revisit it all. I could imagine that that would be true for some people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If basically that idea of that you are lovable, however it gets in, is the thing that can create this for people, whether it's through the trauma or not through the trauma, potentially.
Yeah. But then it's a question of then the question is of what sort of mental brain state are you in to allow this new stuff to come into you. And
right.
adolescence happens to be a very good place for that to happen. Most of us, when we get adults, get pretty rigidified and rarely get into a state of that openness. Although right now, my main research is on psychedelics, actually. Psychedelics also are states of mind in which all kind of new stuff can come in. I think hypnosis can also do that. But what we see in our psychedelic research, people go back into their trauma.
Right.
We have not seen people in our research who have a psychedelic experience and go into other places, and they deal with their trauma always.
Yeah. One of the things that happens in our work when we do the week-long or the 18-month and the people are deep is it's really common for people to say, I feel like I'm on an hallucinogenic. It's a really, really common thing for people to say. And if it's a big emotional process, they'll think that they feel like they're on ayahuasca. If it's, then there's some processes where they feel like it's MDMA, and there's some process, particularly the mental deconstruction process, where they feel like they're on LSD. I wonder if you have any theories as to why somebody who's not on hallucinogenics would feel like they're on hallucinogenics.
One reservation I have about the current interest in psychedelics, which I share, is that people will think, oh, I need to take a pill or a drug in order to get into that state. Yeah. I think that's definitely not true. And, I don't know the details of your particular work, but, I had experiences in my life also where my mind was very open, and new stuff came in very profound ways, and they never involved drugs, actually.
Yeah.
And so they involve your mind being open. You have a lot of theta waves in your brain. All kinds of things need to be changed in your consciousness. And when you say that the people you work with have that experience, I go like, yeah, I totally believe that.
Yeah. One of a neuroscientist who's in one of the courses, their thesis was that when the brain has a whole bunch of new channels being created, the visual field isn't prioritized anymore, which is why there's so much visual distortion or whatever, hallucinations. So I thought that was an interesting one.
Yeah.
Neurologically speaking, again, one of the things, Descartes' error, if you've read the book, when he talks about that we really basically make emotional decisions. It's a little more complex than that, is my understanding, but that if our emotional center goes away, that we cease, it'll take us like 4 hours to decide where to have lunch. And I wonder, how do you feel like that relates to the recovery of trauma? If our decision-making process is emotional, how do you think that relates?
Yeah, I think this is how we're built. We need our emotions to be our pilots. But when you get traumatized, your emotions become the pilots to keep sending you back into the trauma direction. And so you need to actually squash that pilot for a while, so you cannot make a decision.
Yeah.
And that you just allow stuff to come in, and that's why having a loving and extremely skillful guide is so important. It's really important because you're so vulnerable at this point. But if you can really let go, either with psychedelics or without, then new stuff comes in and you can reorganize the pilot. Absolutely.
Yeah. On the psychedelic research that I've done, there's one there basically of the big five, it can change openness. They've done the studies that show that in the big five it changes openness. Have you found any modalities that change the neuroses aspect of the big five? Anything that has been measured?
I'm only doing MDMA research. And I'm a small part of a very large multi-site study. And so I have a limited number of subjects. And I can't say something about it on the MDMA research. In my psychodrama work that I do, on which I'm not doing research, which is probably closer to what you do possibly, people do become less neurotic.
Yeah.
People become less reactive. They become less offended by minor issues of other people, because I think the big issue is self-compassion.
Yeah.
And there's a German researcher by the name of Tanja Singer who has done a lot of mindfulness research, very complicated, extremely high quality research. And she came at the end that mindfulness is only helpful if it leads to self-compassion.
Yeah.
And so I don't know to what degree the various psychedelic agents or mind-altering substances increase self-compassion, and MDMA certainly does.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know how it's
been
itself across all the different ones. Yeah.
And there's studies on the psychodrama work on the neuroses. Have you seen the studies that talk about?
No, nobody I know. See, there's of course a big issue in our culture is that what we study is the biology. And if we can put people motionless with their head in a vice and put them in a scanner, we do real science.
Yeah.
But in our culture, the interest in mental processes has basically disappeared.
Yeah.
And so, so what do I study? I study neurofeedback, which is where we can study neural traces. I study psychedelics because there's a drug, etc., etc. But my favorite clinical work is psychodrama. And there's no way in hell anybody is going to give me the $1 million it would take to do good psychodrama study.
Right. Yeah. Um, uh, so another question that I have for you is that I've noticed when I'm working with people in the long term, it's pretty rare, but what happens is they'll get to a place where people who come to me have their lives pretty well together, right? Like half of the people are CEOs, a lot of
Right.
people from good colleges, but the first year or two might be getting themselves into a place where the trauma isn't really driving them anymore at any kind of measurable level. They feel love, they feel compassion for themselves, they feel a sense of oneness, and then something happens like somewhere like 6 months after that sometimes, where it seems like they like revert, and sometimes for 3 or 4 months deeply into something that's like even before I ever met them. And they'll go into this, like, they'll really go into a sense of attachment issues where they're not seeing the world clearly. They can even say it. They can say, I'm not seeing the world clearly. And
Uh-huh.
then when they pop out at the end of that, and it's a really touch and go thing that I've noticed, but when they pop out at the end of that, like they all of a sudden are far softer. They're it's like they have a aura about them of just loving everybody that comes around them. Have
Hmm.
is there any research? Do you know anything about that process, or because it seems to be
Yeah.
aspects called healing?
Yeah. See, I think your observation is a very important observation, and this is exactly the stuff that people are not studying.
Yeah,
Um, so I hang out with the internal family systems people a
yeah,
lot, and about dealing with parts. And I find the internal family systems model a very indispensable model. In some ways, maybe you use very similar models somewhere in your mind. So that people
yeah,
are built of parts, and different parts are in control at different times. And when a part that has been managing you successfully, like to not ever feel vulnerable, or to never feel dependence,
yes,
or
yeah,
to
yeah.
never give control over somebody else, that manager is going to scream like crazy, like, no, I'm not going to make myself vulnerable.
That's right.
And so it's interesting you talked about it, how it's a phase, because as an individual therapist, I don't see it so much as a phase in my practice. I see it, but I see these things coming up very much like, no, I'm not going to love you or anybody else. I'm not going to give up part of my work in order to be with my kids because I need to be invulnerable. Yeah, okay, I'm not going to give up control. And I think the trick is to really validate that part
Right.
and how important that part has been in your survival. And to say, man, that part was really allows you to survive all this stuff. It's so important. Love that part of you, even though everybody else may hate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after it's validated, and it's very important to my mind, to really validate how useful that part is in helping you to have become a relatively independent person, and to say this is a very good part, and maybe we can sort of change the job description a little bit.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's interesting. It feels to me it's almost fractal. Like that exact process happens at different scales through like I would say almost everything that we do in our work is about learning to love the different aspects of ourselves. And
Yeah.
the more usually the ones that are like the ones at the very base of the personality, the ones that are like hardly visible at the beginning of a process.
Right.
Those are the ones that seem to have like that big hiccup near the later stages of the biggest.
Right.
Yeah. Is there any researchers or anybody who focuses on that kind of core
I
personality?
don't think so. See, the mind has disappeared from research.
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a real very big deal, you know. And I would say, if you have living there in that part of California, it's basically the center of the world these days. And Boston used to be the center of the world, but now you guys are the center of the world. Man, talk to other people who have access to money and research. Like, we need to study these mind process. We need to study these parts.
They're all studying psychedelics.
We don't need to do got a brain scans for everybody, because the brain is basically built on that models, and we human beings we're a symbolic species, and we live by symbols, and our symbols cannot be captured in these brain scans. I love brain scans, done a lot of them, but you know, at the end, these mental processes are what makes us the unique human beings that we are, and we are not studying it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Almost
necessarily great. And because we're not studying it, you do your work, and it sounds really fantastic, and other people do their work, but there is no common language, because there is no common scientific or conceptual framework by which we all work together, which we should.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about in all those modalities, because you've been able to go around the world and see a lot of them. This modality that we're using comes from a lot of those, but it also has a strong sense of the spiritual, from Christianity to Buddhism to Taoism to the Sufis, like a lot of those practices we use as well. And I was wondering how much of the work that you see out there that's really having a deep effect on that early trauma is also using some of these practices. Because I know you mentioned yoga and mindfulness. Yeah.
Well, you know, all these practices have evolved out of helping people to deal with their pain.
Yeah.
And so, you know, a very simple thing I like to talk about is that chanting is universal. Now, even the Dutch Reformed church that I grew up in, which is the most lugubrious church you can imagine, people still go, you know? So chanting together, however, you know, unbeautiful it may be, still gives you a sense of community. And of course, at the core of human beings is that we need to be communal.
Yeah.
And we need to be in sync with other people. And so that is, of course, at the end, you cannot avoid but going there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's our nature. Huh? How do we get a sense of belonging? How do we get a sense of being in touch with each other? How can you be an old person and commune with a young person unless that larger reality gets in some way incorporated into yourself?
Yeah. That's one of the things that we'll do in our week-long courses. Right from the beginning, the whole week-long course is about looking at the voice in our head, and particularly the abusive, reoccurring voice in our head, and laying it out in a way, and then approaching it and figuring out how to have different relationships with it. Not getting rid of it, but learning to love it, learning to, and we'll list on the wall, everybody will list their voice in the head. So in a way that they can't get away from it. It's like very, very clear. And one of the things that seems to happen there, doesn't seem to, I know it happens, is when people excavate all this stuff and then they look around the room and they see 11 other people loving them despite of this, that's no excuse not to love yourself. It does something for the human on the other side. One of the questions I have is how big of a process or how important do you think it is to actually just like, it's big in AA too, where you're just owning these things that you don't like about yourself, just that simple act. How important to the process is that? You think it's?
Oh, I think it's huge, because it has to do with shame, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And hiding yourself is about shame.
Yes.
And you don't want anybody to know that about you. And indeed, in order to fully become yourself, the dark parts of yourself and the nasty parts of yourself need to be out there, and to be realized that we all carry that stuff around. That is, we can't just project it on Mitch McConnell, because we all have a little bit of that in ourselves also. It's like, no, part of me is also nasty, and it's very important to put it out there and say, every part of me is there, and every part of me needs to be known to the people who I feel close to.
Yeah, exactly. One of the most common questions in the list of questions, so we took all the questions from people, and then I'm asking as many of them as I can, because that seemed to make it most simple. One of the biggest questions was people wanted to know what was the personal practice, not going to a therapist, not going into a group practice. What was the personal practices that you found most effective at healing trauma? It's a question I hate answering, so I imagine.
Well, I can tell you what's been helpful for me along the road, and some of it was professional, some was not professional. I think one of the most helpful things that I ever got was rolfing.
Yeah.
I was a very sickly child, and so I was born at the end of the Second World War in the Netherlands, and about half of my generation died of starvation. And so I was a very sickly little kid, and I don't feel that in myself anymore, but I grew up having a body that was very defensive. And I think I was stuck in that body in a way, and then I got rolfed. And I think no mental process whatsoever. I mean, that's where the issue of, is it all relational? No, it's not all relational. It was not even my relation to my body. Somebody needed to just open up my goddamn body, and and allow my chest to open up, and to be able to stand big, and to not be always frozen internally. It was extraordinarily helpful for me. So that is very important. I think my yoga practice, which is not doing so well these days, was enormously helpful. In the rough times of my time, just going to a yoga practice, having a practice, and finding your core and working very hard on those postures, enormously helpful. Again, non-relational.
Yes.
No, the voice of your yoga teacher was terribly important, but none of my yoga teachers knew me as a person.
Right. Yes.
But still, it allowed me to really get in touch with myself and to take care of myself in a sort of deeper way. So those were very important things. And on a professional level, dealing with my parts was enormously important. And the shame you feel, that is a very big thing that I saw both in my patients and myself, is that trauma is one thing, but the biggest thing about trauma is hating the role that you played in your own trauma.
Yeah.
Not standing up for yourself, or getting along, sucking up to your abuser, or and so you hate yourself for not having been true to yourself at that point of the trauma. And you need to go there.
Yeah.
And really feel that 3-year-old, the 5-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 50-year-old, you were a coward, and you can understand that because you were really scared. And so you need to go there and really deal with the parts of you that you really despise. And you cannot do that for me. In your trauma that you want, you have to love me more because I can't stand myself.
Right.
And you can't do that.
Yeah, that I find that it's like a watershed moment in healing a certain pattern in a human, is that there's a moment where they grieve the fact that they've been doing this to themselves, or they've been agreeing to this for the last 20 or 30 years, and that they
or 50 years or 80 years.
And that moment,
and how much you have missed.
Yeah. And and that is often the precursor to loving themselves, or loving that aspect of themselves, is that grief.
I think usually, I see a lot of people who sort of quite late in life, when they finally start taking themselves seriously, do the work, and they go like, oh man, I miss so much.
Right, yeah.
But it's also, but at least I have a few good years left to make use of all this. Like, you know, yeah.
Speaking of this, so I did a lot of work in philanthropy with early childhood. We did mindfulness in schools, and we did the emotional, the body part of it, an emotional fluidity practice with kids called hand-in-hand parenting, which is amazing for anybody who's parents. And what I noticed is that my experience, and I'm wondering if there's research or if your experience is the same, that trauma heals a lot quicker the younger they are. When the neurology is still plastic, it seems like there's a...
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it.
Okay.
And like, you know, as the Jesuits say, you get him young, you know, like,
right.
And there's, you know, and Bruce Perry writes a lot about it. Like, if you get people the first year of life, you know, you can change everything. And the longer you wait, and then the ACE study shows the same thing. All the studies, the longer you wait, the harder it is. And it doesn't mean it's ever too late, but you know, when you talk about your philanthropy, my reaction is, isn't it great that you're doing that? And there's a lot of philanthropy going on in schools to do the right thing, but it never becomes part of the school system.
Yeah.
It's always exterior.
Yeah.
And so my dream is that every kid in America gets the 5 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and self-regulation.
Yeah.
But starting in kindergarten, self-regulation and taking care of yourself becomes a core of the curriculum, because you need to have that in order to become a productive member of society. You know, it's not like let's get these nice people from California to fund this a nice yoga program. No, our kids need it. Like, you know.
We at some point we can talk, not offline, but our experience was that if you had to go to the teachers, not to the school system.
Absolutely. And everybody finds that. Yeah.
And when we did that, we could scale with $500,000. We could scale to like 700,000 kids doing mindfulness. And so we found a business model that allowed us to reach a ton of people through the school system very cheaply. But offline at some point, I don't think we would. I think we'd bore a lot of
great. Yeah.
Conversation. I guess the question that I have is, to be political for a second, ACEs, like if we as a society had the moonshot of reducing ACEs, right, which is adverse childhood experiences for those,
right,
which we know is linked to everything from drug addiction rates to heart disease rates to mental illness rates. If we were to do that, 2 questions. What do we need it to do as a society to get there? A, to make that a priority in your mind. And 2, what would be the back of your napkin plan for what would be the most important first steps to take in reducing ACEs in our society?
Well, it's interesting. I made a small meeting recently in which Jim Carroll, the author, said, you know, much of politics should be an educational process. And when we have presidential debates, debates about politics, to make ACEs, put ACEs where it should be, namely our biggest national priority. Like, it's the biggest source of mental illness, biggest source of opioid addiction, biggest source of everything. And
also biggest drain on our economy.
Exactly, everything. Like, you know, and one of the disappointing things about the Obama administration is that they did not go there, and they did more of let's compete with kids in Finland and Denmark who score so much better than our kids do. Why did they score much better? Because the societies actually know about ACEs and take it into account and set up school systems where the ACEs are addressing the ACEs at the core. And we should make it our national debate. If you treat your kids well, they will be curious. They will be eager to learn. They will be eager to get along with other people because they feel safe. And so it's a big, gigantic educational project, which sort of goes against the capitalist mentality of let's make as much money as we can. So that's not only true for politics, it's also true for the medical system. When people also are not doing it, they give lip service to it, but they don't do it. And so there needs to be a pervasive, and I think the best way of doing it is in school systems. How they get on a state-by-state basis, get to accept the 4R idea that self-regulation gets taught from the very first moment on, and get a bunch of people to teach. That's the way to do tapping, that we do breathing, that we do singing, and we do yoga, and we do Psychodrama, and we do all this stuff. All the stuff actually that my kids got in school, because I'm a well-off person. I said, so I was able to send my kids to the school, but they got all that stuff.
Right.
And so then you get the whole gigantic income inequality thing, that the poorer you are, the less of the stuff you get, and the more you get blamed for not being able to function.
Yeah.
So that should be a big part of the national debate, and to really talk about how, but of course, there's an enormous, what's happening in our current political system, of course, is just stunning. We're undermining the climate thing, we're undermining any of this stuff. Like, no, we're not going to do any of this. In fact, we're going to make the world into a worse place. And I think when people address that, they are not quite articulate enough. Like, no, why would you want to destroy everything that's good about us? And to really bring that issue up, we need to be safe. Life needs to be predictable. And to make that a continuous refrain in response to everything that we do, basically.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question. We talked a little bit before this started of how it was really important for you to keep your one-on-one practice, because it a certain level of humility, whereas when you're talking and you've written a book, everybody looks at you like you have answers, and then you're working with somebody one-on-one and like the humanity and the reality of life sets in. I'm wondering how, one, can you just talk a little bit about the importance for you of that humility, and two, what for those, because there's quite a few people on the call that are facilitators or coaches, or can you also just speak to the importance and how you do it, how you maintain that practice? Because my experience is that when we do that, it makes a huge difference. So.
Well, for one thing, I rarely get accused of humility. You know, so I wouldn't even call it humility, but I would call it like curiosity certainly is an issue, and so I would hate to know everything, because then there's nothing else to be discovered. And so why do I have a practice, and why do I take all kinds of different people in my practice? It's because I want to be challenged in what I do. I had a teacher at one point, a very well-respected guy in Boston, who then became an administrator of a large hospital. I said, why did you take this job? He says, Bessel, you know, at a certain point, you have seen it all, and every patient becomes like a predictable entity. And I go like, wow, that's weird. That's never happened to me. And now that I'm 76 years old, it still is not happening to me. And I find every person who walks into my office a unique individual with a unique capacity. So that uniqueness and finding out how everybody has different adaptation and different issues, and that one size doesn't fit all is, you know, I couldn't do without that. You know, I couldn't just put my little template on everybody and say it works for everybody. And I'm incredibly intrigued with all the different solutions that people find for having dealt with what they deal with. And I hope that everybody I know will continue to be this curious till the day they die. Like, you know?
Yeah. And on your personal journey, where do you find your edge of your own development process? Where are you now at your own edge, if you're willing
well,
to?
You know, the big issue at my age is death.
Yeah.
You know, and being relevant, and possibly confronting the fact that you may not be relevant to a larger world at some point, because of course you get spoiled at some point and people take you seriously. And then I found this first with my kids about 15 years ago. My kids started to treat me like an old man. Then let me do it for you, Dad. Let me, like, it's our turn now. And I think the reality is that people need to come into their own, and that they need to abandon you at some point. And whether you're dead or alive doesn't much make a difference, because they'll remember you as this icon rather than as a person who's actively active. And that's, of course, a thing that is a real issue to come to terms with, is to just to give up being a person who is not there to move things around. I think that's a thing that really, and I was struggling with it also.
Yeah. What pleasure do you find in that new identity that's coming online?
Pleasure?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much pleasure I find. It's, you know, it's very clear that it's something to be dealt with. You know, like, do I keep my yoga practice going, or do I allow to myself to just become a puppet along? You know, like, it takes more and more energy to do things. And at what point do you accept your limitations? You know, at the first office I ever had, some patient, so clearly a very messed up person, wrote on the bathroom mirror in soap, live with the acceptance of your limitations or the pain of your transgressions. I thought that was pretty good, actually. And so learning to live with the acceptance of your limitations is also a very important issue.
Yeah.
I find the pleasure, well, no, I cannot say that I find it.
You can't, no pleasure. Yeah. Awesome. All right, well, this was our time. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Do you have any questions for me, or anything else to say that we haven't, that I forgot, anything important as you have the
You probably did, but
okay.
Anyway, it's a real pleasure talking with you.
It was a pleasure.
And to really see, sort of infer what wonderful work you're doing also. That's really great to hear.
Yeah. Thank you.
So it's a privilege. Thank you.
I feel the same way. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.